Your husband buy you that?" The voice carried down the whole primary firing line, loud enough that the shooting order behind it went quiet to listen. Staff Sergeant Cody Mercer stood over the open rifle case, with his hands on his hips, grinning at the woman kneeling beside it. "Sweetheart, this is a qualification line, not a gun show. That's a real nice toy somebody spent a real lot of money on. Case it up and clear my firing point before you hurt yourself." The woman did not answer. She was maybe 49, plain range clothes, a faded ball cap pulled low, a temporary visitor badge clipped to her collar, with one word stamped across it in red. Pending. No rank, no name tape, no aide trailing behind her the way important people always came. To every young Marine on that line, she was somebody's wife who had wandered onto the wrong stretch of dirt, and Mercer was doing what Mercer did best, which was make sure everybody saw him being right about it. She reached into the case, 2 fingers on the bolt handle. She eased it back, checked the chamber by feel, rode it home, and decocked the rifle against the flat of her thumb without a sound. Then she laid the weapon down in the cradle, muzzle down range, action open, in the exact center of the bench. Sterile, economical. The hands never fumbled once. 1,300 hours. The July sun sat white and hard over the known distance range at the weapons training battalion, and the wind flags along the 800-meter line snapped and fell and snapped again. Heat shimmer crawled off the berms. Somewhere down in the pits, a target carrier rattled up on its rails. She had been ordered off harder lines than this by better men than him. A ripple of laughter moved through the shooting order. A lance corporal near the tower laughed loudest of all, a kid named Dominic Reyes, 20 years old and desperate to be liked by the man with the clipboard. Mercer soaked it in like sunlight. The range stretched out behind her in the heat, long and clean and indifferent. 6 firing points at the primary, the tower with its faded battalion crest, the berms rising in their steps toward the 800-meter line, and beyond them, the pits where the target carriers waited on their rails. 41 years the Corps had run rifles across this ground. It did not care who mocked whom. It only ever asked one question, the same question it asked everyone, and it always took its answer in the same currency. She knew the ground. She had known ranges like it on 3 continents. She could have named the wind off the flags to within 2 miles an hour, and the come up to the 800 to within 1/10 of a mile. And she said none of it, because none of it was the kind of thing you said to a man who had already decided who you were. The woman stood. She did not argue. She lifted the visitor badge off her collar, set it face down on the bench beside the rifle, stepped back off the firing point, and folded her hands in front of her. She looked out at the range the way a carpenter looks at a house, reading the flags first, the berms, the pit markers, the tower, the access road at the far gate. She read the ground before she read a single face. It is a thing you learn in only one line of work, and you never unlearn it. People read faces first, because people are the danger people fear. She had spent a life in a profession where the ground was the danger, the fold of earth, the shift of wind, the 100 meters of open you had to account for before you ever thought about a man. So she read the range, flags, then berms, then pits, then tower, then road. Faces last. Faces were rarely the problem. Up on the tower steps, Master Sergeant Gideon Pruitt watched her do it. Pruitt was 47 and had coached this line for the better part of 30 years. He had seen 10,000 shooters, uncased 10,000 rifles, and he knew the difference between a person who owned a nice weapon and a person the weapon owned back. He had watched her hands. He had watched her clear that action the way other people breathed, and he had watched her eyes go to the wind flags before they went to Mercer, which was the thing that put a cold little thread up the back of his neck. Mercer was still talking. Something about liability, about how civilians thought money bought skill, about how his line ran to standard. The order chuckled on cue. The woman said nothing. She had gone still, not the frozen stillness of someone afraid, but the settled stillness of someone who had decided the next several minutes were not worth a word. Pruitt found himself doing something he had not done in a long time. He started counting the wind flags, left to right, near to far, the way she just had. Full value at the 600, switching at the 8. A fishtail down in the pits. He looked back at her. She was already watching the 800-meter flag, and her lips had moved just barely, the way a shooters do when they are running a wind call nobody asked them for. Mercer clapped his clipboard against his thigh and strutted back toward the tower, satisfied, certain he had run another problem off his firing point. The woman sat down on the bench behind the line, hat low, hands loose, as motionless as a fence post in the heat. And Master Sergeant Pruitt, 30 years on the line, could not for the life of him stop watching her hands. Something on this range was about to be measured. He could feel it the way you feel a storm 2 valleys over. He just did not yet know the number. The line stalled 20 minutes later. It was a scoring dispute, the kind that ate qualification days alive. A target in the pits had come up mismarked, and the tower and the pit crew were arguing over the phone line about a possible 3-point swing on a Marine's record. Everything stopped. 10 shooters stood down on the line with hot rifles, and nothing to do while 2 staff sergeants yelled at a handset. Pruitt came down off the tower steps. He walked past the idle shooters, past Mercer's turned back, and he stopped in front of the woman on the bench. "Ma'am," he said, quiet, so it stayed between them. "Lane 6 is open while they sort the pits. 800 meters. I've got a box of match sitting right there." He paused. "I'd be curious what that rifle does." She looked up at him from under the cap. For a moment she measured him the same way she had measured the range. Then she stood. "Cold bore's fine," she said. 3 words. She did not fill the silence after them. She carried the rifle to Lane 6 herself. No cart, no help. The escorts had not arrived yet. The dispute in the pits still crackled unresolved over the phone. For a moment, the whole range belonged to her, and to the one coach who had handed her a lane, and she treated it the way she treated everything, as work to be done exactly right, and no larger than that. She set the case down open, laid a shooting mat, and built her position on the dirt in the time it took Pruitt to walk back to the tower. Prone. Bipod. The stock came into her shoulder, and her cheek came down onto it, and everything about her went quiet and square and settled, like water finding level. Natural point of aim. She did not muscle the rifle onto the target. She let the target come to her. There was nothing showy in any of it. That was what Pruitt could not stop watching. A young shooter fought the rifle, wrestled it, forced the reticle onto the target with muscle and hope. She did the opposite. She removed herself from the equation entirely until there was nothing left between the trigger and the truth, but arithmetic and bone. She read the flags one more time. The switching wind at the 8, the fishtail in the pits. Her hand moved once on the scope's elevation, a small, precise thing, and then it did not move again. 1 breath in, half of it out. Hold. The first round broke. 800 meters downrange, a spotter in the pits flinched at the crack overhead, and then leaned into his scope. He keyed the phone. He said a number. Up in the tower, a second staff sergeant frowned and told him to check it again. She fired the second round. Then the third. She did not hurry. Roughly 1 round every 8 seconds, the bolt cycling under her palm in a single motion, the rifle barely climbing before it settled back to exactly where it had been. 4, 5, 6. The rhythm of it was almost boring to watch, and that was the terrifying part. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud beyond the report. Just a woman putting bullets exactly where she looked. By the 8th round, the line had gone silent on its own. By the 10th, nobody on that firing point was pretending to do anything but watch her. Down in the pits, the crew ran the target up on the carrier and stopped taping. They did not tape it. They stood in the trench and looked at it. Then the phone crackled up on the line, and the pit chief's voice came through, flat with disbelief. Tower, pits, confirmed 10 rounds, cold bore. A pause. Groups just over 3 inches, all 10. You could cover it with a coffee cup. The tower called down and made him say it twice. On the line, the other shooters had drifted toward lane 6 without deciding to. Rifles hung forgotten. A corporal 2 lanes down had stopped chewing his gum. They had all fired that same 800-meter stage 100 times, sweated for a passing score, celebrated a group the size of a dinner plate. What they had just watched did not live in the same world as their scores. It was not better shooting. It was a different thing wearing shooting's clothes. 10 rounds, 800 meters. No spotter. No sighter shots to warm the barrel. No fuss. The line forgot to breathe. Mercer's grin was gone. His knuckles had gone white on the tower rail, and he was staring downrange at a number that did not fit anywhere in the story he had been telling all afternoon. Pruitt let out a long breath through his nose. Slow. The breath of a man who has just seen a face he thought he would never see again. He had seen one group like that in his whole life, exactly one, and it was not on a firing line. The woman came up off the mat, cleared the rifle, and laid it open on the bench. She had not smiled. She had not looked at Mercer once. She looked at the flags. The pit crew was still standing in the trench, staring at a paper target they would talk about for the rest of their careers, and the wind came switching down the range and moved the flags, and nobody on lane 1 through 5 had remembered yet to load. Mercer did not back down. Men like Mercer never do when the ground shifts. They only dig. He came off the tower with his jaw set and worked the one angle he had left, which was the crowd. He walked the line and told the shooting order what they had just seen. He told it his way. She was a range groupie, he said. Some contractor's wife who spent her weekends buying custom rifles and getting lucky. 10 rounds meant nothing. Anybody could catch lightning once. What mattered was that there was an unauthorized civilian on his live-fire line, and that was a safety problem, not a shooting demonstration. That's not skill, he said, loud, working them. That's an incident waiting to happen. Reyes, you still got your phone? Get her on video for the file. Lance Corporal Reyes hesitated. He looked at the woman on the bench, calm, hands folded, watching the flags. And he looked at Mercer, and he lifted the phone, because at 20 years old, the man with the clipboard was still a bigger force in his life than the quiet stranger who had just done the impossible. But something had shifted in him all the same. He had grown up on stories like the one framed in the schoolhouse, the impossible group, the legend nobody could match, and he had spent his short career assuming those people lived somewhere else, on some other range, larger than life. It had not occurred to him that one of them might sit down on a bench in a faded ball cap and let a staff sergeant call her sweetheart and simply wait. The phone felt heavier in his hand than it had a minute before. The woman noticed the phone. She noticed everything, but she did not perform for it, and she did not hide from it. She simply asked one question, in the same 3-word economy she gave everything. Your name, Staff Sergeant? Mercer read it as a threat, the way small men read every calm question as a threat. Mercer. Staff Sergeant Mercer. Range Safety Officer, this line, and you can write that down anywhere you want, sweetheart. Because when the report goes up, it's going to say a civilian violated my firing point and refused to leave. She wrote it down. Not on paper. She turned her visitor badge over in her hand, and, with a pen from her pocket, wrote the time on the back of it. 1341. Lane 6. Mercer. Then she put the badge back in her pocket and folded her hands again, and said nothing more. It was such a small thing, writing a time on the back of a badge. Mercer never saw her do it. He was too busy performing for an audience that had already, though he did not know it yet, begun to turn. But she had learned long ago that the quiet record outlives the loud one. Times, names, lanes, facts, set down without heat, waiting. The target always answered, and so, in its slower way, did the paper. Pruitt tried to cool it. He stepped between them, low-voiced, and told Mercer to let it go, that he had personally cleared the lane, that there was no safety violation because the coach had authorized the shot. But on this line, in this billet, Mercer held the range safety authority, and Pruitt held only wisdom, and everyone there knew which one the paperwork listened to. Mercer waved him off like a fly. The shooting order laughed when Mercer told them to laugh, and the woman sat unmoved in the center of all of it, an island of quiet in a sea of somebody else's noise. If you have ever watched someone in a room full of people decide they were too small to bother answering, then you already understand her, and you already understand this channel. Subscribe to Honor Tales. Stay on the line. The number always comes due. Mercer went to the tower desk to make it official. He sat down at the log, and he began to write, and what he wrote was not what had happened. He wrote that an unidentified civilian had gained unauthorized access to an active live fire range. He wrote that she had discharged a weapon on his firing line without authorization, leaving out that the senior line coach had authorized it and handed her the ammunition. He wrote that she had created a safety hazard and refused a lawful order to depart. He wrote the word he liked best, which was refused, 3 separate times, because refused was the word that turned a nuisance into a violation. Then he picked up the desk phone and called base security to have her badge pulled, and the woman escorted off the installation before qualification resumed. It was clean in its way. Get her gone before anyone senior wandered down. Get the statement in first, because the first statement is the one everyone believes. Put her off the range as a security matter and let the paper do the rest. On paper, in the space of 10 minutes, her afternoon had gone from a demonstration nobody could explain to a documented safety incident with her name, or the lack of it, at the center. The security escort arrived in a white truck, 2 of them, polite and bored, a corporal and a private, there to walk a civilian to the gate. The woman gave them no friction at all. She knelt at the bench. She lifted the rifle, cycled the bolt once to show a clear chamber, dropped the magazine, thumbed the loose rounds into a box, and broke the weapon down into its case with a speed and a certainty that made the corporal stop and actually watch. The bipod folded. The bolt came out and went into its own sleeve. The optic cover snapped closed. 10 seconds, maybe 12, and the most dangerous thing on that bench was a padded case with a handle. The corporal had escorted a lot of people off a lot of ranges. He had never once watched a civilian clear a precision rifle to a standard he could not have matched himself. The private watched too, and neither of them said anything, and the silence of 2 escorts who have just realized that the person they came to remove is more competent with a weapon than anyone they have ever met is its own kind of testimony. She had done nothing they could point to. That was the maddening thing about her, the thing Mercer's statement could never capture. She had broken no rule they could name. She had simply been better than the story being told about her, quietly, completely, without asking permission. And there is no line on any incident form for that. She stood easy, hands loose, and waited to be walked to the gate. But Pruitt was not waiting. Pruitt had gone into the tower and picked up the landline to the battalion office, and he was talking fast and low into it, one hand cupped around the mouthpiece. I need the commanding officer down at the KD range, now. Yes, now. I've got a range safety officer about to escort somebody off this installation, and I'm telling you, sir, you need to see who it is before that happens, because if I'm right about who she is, this is going to be the worst afternoon of that staff sergeant's career. and I would like it to at least be a short one." He hung up. He looked out the tower glass at the woman standing quiet by the white truck, at Reyes lowering the phone slowly, doubt finally moving in the kid's face like weather. The escort corporal gestured toward the truck. The woman picked up her case, and still, in the set of her shoulders, in the stillness of her, there was not a single sign of a person who believed she was losing anything at all. Pruitt came down off the tower and crossed to her, quietly, before the truck could pull away. He had to be sure. 30 years deserved sure. "Ma'am." He kept his voice down, just the two of them, in the shade of the tower. "That group down there, I've seen one like it in my life. It's framed on a wall in the schoolhouse. Cold bore, high angle, a hold nobody teaches because nobody can do it twice." He watched her face. "So I'm going to ask you one shooter's question, and then I'll leave you be. That altitude, that switching wind, cold barrel. How'd you hold it?" She looked at him for a long moment. Something passed behind her eyes. Not pride. Something older and heavier than pride. "Wind was the easy part," she said, and that was all Pruitt needed, because only one kind of person answers that question that way. Not the wind, not the drop, not the math. Those were the easy parts. The easy parts were the ones that only tried to kill the shot. It was the other parts, the human parts that stayed with you. Pruitt had spotted for shooters in 2 wars before his knees, and his eyes sent him to the coaching side of the line. He knew, the way you know weather, the exact texture of a person who had paid the price the group on that wall implied. It was not in the shooting. Anyone could be taught to shoot. It was in the stillness afterward, the way she had not celebrated the 10 rounds, had not so much as glanced back at them, had gone straight to reading the flags again, as if the group meant nothing. Because to her, it did mean nothing. The group was easy. The group was always the easy part. He turned on his heel and walked straight to Mercer, who was signing his statement at the desk with a flourish. "Staff Sergeant." Pruitt's voice had dropped all the way to iron. "Tear that up. Whatever you think is happening here, you are wrong, and you are about to find out exactly how wrong in front of your whole line. Tear it up, walk down there, and apologize, and you might keep your billet. That's the last piece of good advice you're going to get today." Mercer scoffed. He actually laughed. "Master Sergeant, with respect, stay in your lane. I run the safety on this line. Not you." He clicked his pen. "She's gone in 5 minutes, and this is over." Down by the truck, the woman had gone still again, but a different still. Her eyes had lifted past the tower, past the berms, to the far gate and the range access road, where a plume of pale dust was rising into the July heat. A staff car. Government plates. Coming down the range road at a purposeful clip, no siren, no hurry, just the steady approach of something official that had somewhere to be. She saw it a full 10 seconds before anyone else did. Of course she did. She had been reading the ground all afternoon. Whatever was in that car, she had been expecting it. And she was the only person on that entire range who was not about to be surprised. If you want to be there when the dust settles, subscribe to Honor Tales now, because the door is already opening. Before the car reached the tower, step back 15 years, to a ridge on the far side of the world, because that is the only place the rest of this makes sense. 2011. She was 34 then, a gunnery sergeant, and she had a name on the net that she had not chosen and did not want. Down in a dry valley, a squad of 11 Marines had gone to ground under fire they could not move through, and the window to pull them out was closing like a fist. There was one ridge that looked down into that valley, and there were 2 people on it. Her and a 22-year-old corporal named Micah Sorensen, who spotted for her and who talked too much, and who she would have walked into that same valley for without a second's thought. They held the ridge alone. She lay in the rocks through the hottest part of the afternoon, and she did the only thing she had ever been truly good at. She read the wind coming up the draw. She read the range to every fold of ground where a threat could sit. She read the light and the mirage boiling off the stone. And one disciplined round at a time, unhurried, she opened a corridor through that valley, and she kept it open. And she held it open with nothing but patience and arithmetic and a rifle. While 11 men she had never met crawled and ran and were dragged toward the birds. Sorensen called the wind and the hits in a steady stream beside her, his voice the only warm thing on that cold stone. 11 Marines moved. She counted them. That was the thing about her that nobody understood until it was too late. She counted everything, and she never lost the count. 11 onto the birds. 11. She remembered every one of the shots. Not the way you remember a thing you are proud of, the way you remember a debt. The first one, into the shadow of the far wall, at a range she had ranged twice to be sure. The wind that came up the draw at midday and tried to walk her rounds off into the rocks, and how she had let it, and held into it, and let the bullet ride the moving air back onto the line she wanted. Sorensen's voice in her ear the whole time, steady, a little too fast, reading the splash and the drift and calling her hits like a man calling a horse race he already knew the ending to. He had been the warm thing on the cold stone. He was always talking. She had never once told him to be quiet, and she was glad of that now, and would be for the rest of her life. The corridor cost what corridors cost, covering the last of the extract, in the last minutes, when the fire came looking for the ridge that had been hurting it all day. Micah Sorensen did not come down off that mountain. She carried what that meant down the slope in the dark, and she carried it a long way after, and she has been carrying it ever since. They gave her the call sign the way you give a medal you cannot pin on grief. Longbow, the one who reaches out and touches the thing that cannot be reached. For a while after, there were people who wanted her to be a symbol, a poster, a number they could put in a briefing to prove something about grit, or the Corps, or what a woman could do with a rifle. She let none of them have her. She went back to the line instead, because the line did not want anything from her except the truth of the next round. And the truth was the only thing she had left that did not cost her something to give. She never said the call sign aloud again. Not once in 15 years. Other people said it. Instructors said it in the schoolhouse when they pointed at the group framed on the wall. Generals said it in briefings. She let it belong to them, and she kept her mouth shut because the call sign was true, and the truth of it had a price that was still, all these years later, standing on a ridge that no longer existed anywhere but behind her eyes. The target always answered. She had learned that at 800 meters and at 1100 and at distances, she was not allowed to say out loud. The target always, always answered. Send the round, and the steel, or the paper, told you the truth of your hold, instantly, and without mercy, and without lies. It was people who were the part that did not answer. People you could hold perfectly, read perfectly, do everything right for, and still lose. She had gone quiet in the years since, and people mistook the quiet for coldness, or for arrogance, or for the aloofness of someone who thought herself above the room. It was none of those. It was the discipline of a person who had learned, at a cost she could not itemize, that words were cheap and the target was not. Say less. Send the round. Let the truth arrive at 800 meters, on time, in a group you could cover with a coffee cup, and let it speak for you, because it would never once say a thing that was not so. That was the quiet she carried onto every firing line for the rest of her life. Not fear. Not pride. A count that always came out to 11 and a 12th name she said to no one. And now, present day, on a dusty known distance range, a staff car door was opening, and the woman the community called Longbow turned to face the one part of any afternoon that had never once frightened her. Mercer was out of patience, and out of patience was the most dangerous thing Mercer had. The staff car had stopped at the tower 100 meters off, and a figure in service uniform was climbing out of it, and Mercer, some animal part of him sensing the ground going out from under his whole story, decided to make it a fact before anyone could make it a question. Get her off the line. Get her gone. If she was already a departing civilian by the time the brass reached the tower, then the paperwork was the truth, and everything else was just noise. He crossed to the white truck in 6 long strides and grabbed her rifle case off the tailgate. That's it. You're done. Off my range. He shoved the case at the escort corporal, and then he did the thing that could not be undone. He closed his hand around the woman's upper arm and hauled, hard, to drag her toward the gate, in front of the shooting order, in front of Pruitt, in front of Reyes's phone, which was still recording, because Mercer himself had told the kid to keep it running. She did not resist. That was the part the video would show, later, to everyone who needed to see it. She did not pull away. She did not brace. She let him move her, let the camera see his hand fisted in her sleeve, and her free hand stayed open and loose and well away from him and from the rifle and from everything, disciplined down to the fingertips, the hand of a person who knew that the most powerful thing she could do in this exact second was nothing at all. And then, for the first time all afternoon, she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone watching a man sign the last line of a document he had not read. "You'll want to let go," she said. Reyes lowered the phone. The kid had gone pale. Somewhere between the 10-round group and this, the story Mercer had been selling had stopped fitting what his own eyes were telling him, and now he was watching a staff sergeant put hands on a woman who had done nothing but sit quietly and shoot the lights out, and every bad feeling he had swallowed all afternoon came up at once. He did not raise the phone again. He just held it, still recording, at his side. Pruitt moved. 30 years, and he still had it in him to cover ground fast, and he put himself between Mercer and the woman with a forearm and a voice like a dropped hatch. "Staff Sergeant, take your hand off her. Now." Mercer's grip only tightened. "This is my line." "It has never once been your line," Pruitt said. She had given him every chance. She had given him the silence, and the question, and the warning, and the smile, and each one had been a door held open, and he had walked past every one of them to the door he wanted. That was the thing about the bright line. Nobody ever pushed her across it. They always chose it themselves. He could have been a footnote, a staff sergeant who ran a tight line and got a little full of himself and backed down when a master sergeant told him to. Nobody would have remembered it past the week. Instead, he had reached for her arm, and in that one motion he had traded a bad afternoon for the end of a career, and he had done it in front of a phone he himself had ordered kept running. There is a kind of man who cannot stop until the ground stops him. She had met a great many of them. They were, everyone, astonished when the ground finally did. Behind them, boots came down onto the range in an unhurried cadence, and a shadow crossed the dirt at the edge of the firing point. Mercer's hand was still knotted in her sleeve when a voice, quiet and absolutely certain, spoke from 10 feet away. And the afternoon ended for Staff Sergeant Cody Mercer, the way a corridor closes. Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Fontaine, commanding officer of the Weapons Training Battalion, 49 years old with 27 of them on ranges exactly like this one, walked onto the firing point, took in the entire scene in a single sweep, and did not raise his voice. He came to the position of attention. He did it before he said a word. A battalion commander, on his own range, bracing up the way a private braces for a general. And the wrongness of that, the sheer impossibility of that, landed on the shooting order like cold water. "Master Guns Beckett," Fontaine said. "Longbow. A beat. I didn't expect you until tomorrow, Master Gunnery Sergeant. My apologies for the reception. The name moved down the line like a current. Beckett. Longbow. Every serious shooter in that battalion had heard the call sign in the schoolhouse. Every one of them had stood in front of the group framed on the wall. Pruitt was already at attention. He had been sure for 10 minutes. Now the whole line knew what he had known, and the rifle case sat on the dirt between them, and the woman in the faded ball cap had not moved a muscle. The same settled square stillness she had worn all afternoon, except now every person on that range finally understood what they were looking at. Mercer's face began to cycle. First the confusion, the blank scramble of a man whose story has just been contradicted by reality. Then the disbelief, the small, desperate shake of the head. No, that's not. She's a civilian, Then the recognition, the awful dawning as the name and the group and the call sign all clicked into a single unbearable picture. Master Gunnery Sergeant, incoming Chief Instructor of the Marksmanship Program. The name under the group on the schoolhouse wall he taught beneath every single day. The most decorated living scout sniper in the Marine Corps, whom he had called Sweetheart, whose rifle he had mocked, whose arm was still, at this very second, clenched in his fist. Then the horror. Mercer let go of her arm as if it had turned to fire. He took a step back, and then another, as if distance could edit the last hour. It could not. There were 15 witnesses and a phone and a signed statement, and there was the group down in the pits, with its 10 rounds under a coffee cup. And there was the woman herself, unmoved, who had told him 3 separate times, in 3 separate ways to stop, and who had, at the very end, smiled and warned him one last time. Every door. He had walked past every single door. Fontaine's eyes went to the hand, to the release of it, and something in his face closed like a bank vault. "You put your hand on her," he said. It was not a question. His gaze moved to Reyes, to the phone at the kid's side. "And I'd wager that's recorded." Reyes nodded, mute, and turned the screen so the colonel could see it was still running. Fontaine turned back to Mercer. "You filed a statement, Staff Sergeant, in the tower, 10 minutes ago." He let the silence do the work. "Everything you wrote in it, you wrote about the incoming chief instructor of this battalion's marksmanship program, under oath, on a false report." He nodded slowly. "You have been very, very thorough today. I'll give you that." Fontaine did not gloat. That was not in him, and it was not needed. He had commanded long enough to know that the worst thing you can do to a man who has built his own gallows is to help him. You simply stand back and let the structure hold his weight. The line came to attention. Reyes went first. 20 years old, still pale, still sick with what he had let himself become for one bad afternoon. He snapped to the position of attention with a crack of boot heels and held it. Eyes forward, the only apology he knew how to make. Then the Marine beside him. Then the whole shooting order, one after another down the line, until every Marine on that firing point stood braced and silent, rendering to the quiet woman with the pending badge in her pocket the honor that her rank and her name and her group on the wall had always been owed. It moved down the line like a wave finding its level. Boot heels, then stillness, then the particular ringing silence of a great many people holding their breath at once. The wind flags hung slack, the heat pressed down, and in the middle of it stood a woman in a faded ball cap with a pending badge in her pocket, who had asked for none of this and needed none of it, and who received it the way she received everything, without a single wasted motion. Beckett let it happen. She did not straighten into it or bask in it. She simply stood inside the ring of attention like a stone inside a stream, and at last she spoke in the even, unhurried voice she had used all afternoon, declining, as she always declined, to make any of it personal. Everything he wrote is on the target, she said. So am I. The institution can read both. She was not asking for his career. She did not need to. She had spent her whole life learning that the target answers on its own. She bent, and with 2 fingers, the same 2 fingers Mercer had mocked over the open case an hour before, she closed the latches on her rifle case and stood and waited for her colonel to finish the day. Mercer stood alone. It is a particular kind of alone, to be the only man not at attention inside a line of Marines who are holding a signed statement that has just become evidence against yourself, on a range where the group framed on the wall belongs to the woman you dragged by the arm. Fontaine relieved him of the line on the spot, quietly, without theater, the way competent men do hard things. The false statement and the recorded assault would route to a formal review, and that review would run its course on facts and not on tempers, because that was how it was supposed to work, and for once it would. No shouting, no spectacle, just a staff sergeant walking off a firing line he no longer ran, and the machinery of an institution turning over to look, calmly, at what he had actually done. There would be statements, and a legal review, and in time a decision, and none of it would be loud. Beckett would be asked for her account, and she would give it in the same 3-word economy she gave everything, and the recording would say the rest, and the false report Mercer had been so proud of would sit in the file contradicting him in his own handwriting. He had wanted paper. He had gotten paper. It simply said the opposite of what he had meant it to say. The record group stayed on the schoolhouse wall. Only now every Marine who walked past it knew the name underneath, and knew that the name had spent an afternoon being called Sweetheart, and had answered with 10 rounds and a silence louder than any of them. There is a reason stories like this one land the way they do, because somewhere underneath all the rank and the dust, every one of us has been measured wrong by someone who was too sure of themselves to look closely. If this one reached you, subscribe to Honor Tales and stay to the last round. The best part is always the quietest. Reyes found her by the trucks as the line broke. He had the phone in his hand, footage intact, and he held it out to her like a boy returning something he had taken. "Master Gunnery Sergeant, it's all here, the whole thing. I didn't delete any of it." He swallowed. I laughed. "Earlier. I want you to know I know that." She looked at him a while. Then she did the thing she did for everyone who ever asked her honestly. She gave him a straight answer and a place to stand. "You stopped filming when it counted," she said. "That's a start." She nodded at the 800-meter line, at the flags going gold in the falling light. "You want to shoot for me? You show up at 06. I'll give you a lane. Everything after that, you earn." Reyes stood a little straighter. Not braced this time, just taller. Dusk came down over the range slow and clean. The shooting order was gone, the tower dark. The trucks pulled off the line. The wind that had switched and fought all afternoon had finally lain down, and the flags hung slack against their poles. Beckett went back out to the 800-meter line alone. She built her position on the bare dirt one more time, unhurried, the rifle coming into her shoulder like something returning home. She loaded 1 round. Cold bore. She always fired one at the end, wherever she was, on whatever line she could find, and she had never once explained it to anyone and never would. She read a wind that wasn't there anymore, out of habit, out of love. She let half a breath out. She held. The round broke, and the single report rolled off the berms and out over the empty range and faded into the coming dark. One clean note for a 22-year-old corporal who had called her wind on a ridge 15 years ago and never come down. 11 she brought home. 1 she did not. The count never changed. She would not have let it. Some griefs you resolve. Some you simply keep and carry and pay in small, honest installments for the rest of your life. And this was one of those, and she had made her peace with the paying. 1 round, cold bore, at the end of every line she ever stood on. It was the only eulogy she trusted, because it was the only one that could not lie. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket as she cased the rifle. A message from a former student, now standing up a new sniper section 3 states away, asking if she would come teach the first cycle. A name she knew, a thing worth doing. She read it, and something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her mouth, and she put the phone away. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she had a lane to give a lance corporal at 06, and a schoolhouse full of Marines who now knew exactly whose group hung on the wall. She picked up the case with 2 fingers. She racked the tower gate closed behind her, and she walked back across the dark range toward the single light burning in the schoolhouse window. A quiet woman who had never needed to raise her voice, because the target had always answered for her. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.